I picked up the book and I breathed in. Never read any Virginia Woolf before, and 2.5 hours later I finished it and breathed out. It was that intense an experience of a kind I'd never had before. That sense of what was going on inside one's mind, and what the sense of seeing all the contradictions and complexities that seemed unique to oneself. Suddenly there they were.
The library was my space, and there was just so much.
To the Harbor Grace excursion with the boys to have a time.
I'm curious how you first read, or what were the context of you first reading Mrs. Dalloway? And what were your first impressions?
Is this on? Yeah. I was enchanted. And I just felt like I just was probably 19 years old. And it was transformative.
Was it for school, or did you just pick it up? Because
I can't even, you'd think I'd have thought about this, or at least cooked up something plausible. You know what, once I had read To the Lighthouse in that year of university, that was it, and I just read them all. And Mrs. Dalloway was among them. So I was 17. Let's really zero in on it. Very formative, right? And I was the age of the young people in Mrs. Dalloway, right? Her young self, and those young people on the cusp of young adulthood. So I was in that green world, and I'm still pretty green.
I hope we all are. I read it in a graduate class. I had never read any Virginia Woolf before. I was a latecomer. I was 21, and I picked up the book and I breathed in. Never read any Virginia Woolf before, and 2.5 hours later I finished it and breathed out. It was that intense an experience of a kind I'd never had before. That sense of what was going on inside one's mind, and what the sense of seeing all the contradictions and complexities that seemed unique to oneself. Suddenly there they were, that everyone was feeling something like this, and that everyone had these experiences of, as Virginia Woolf says, corrupting their inner lives with lies, corruption, chatter, but also recognizing a thing that mattered in the inner life. This was this focused reality in a way that no other book had done for me.
And you quote from her, but also there are slight variations. One of the interesting and important things about this new NYRB Classics edition is that it restores and not annotates, but it restores some of the elements that had been corrected. Can you tell us why that's important?
Well, one of the...
Because you have opinions on that.
There are many opinions. In North America, I'm about to get into the long lecture on the text, and I think I'll be done by 11 p.m. or earlier than that, I promise. All readers in North America have read the American edition published by Harcourt Brace in New York, which is the text that Virginia Woolf wrote a few weeks before, that she sent off to America a few weeks before she made her final revision. And at the end of the book, she made some drastic changes about how she thought about Septimus Warren Smith's suicide. In the North American text, it says, he made her feel the beauty, made her feel the fun. She crossed that out for the British text and left that out entirely and put in something about how he had died while they went on living. She made it a moral point. And it seems to me that readers want to take possession of a book, but I hope that we treat books the way we treat human beings, that they have rights of their own, and whom they want to be is what we should let them be. So focusing on these small details of revision seemed to me to be a kind of respect for another human being that applies to a book. Is that, that's It's not 11 p.m. yet, but
No, it's far from 11, but I think that's completely apt because it's an organism.
Yes.
Still, right?
very much so. In other words, it seems to me that, sorry, the way to treat a book is the way you should treat another human being. It has rights of its own. It will tell you things you don't want to know. It has secrets that it's going to keep from you forever, and you're never going to understand it entirely. And that if you treat it as the product of some generalized social force, you're reducing it to an object.
Exactly, and then it's static.
That's right.
Yeah,
Whereas
you kill it, basically.
This book looks different every time. I mean, I must have read it 30 or 40 times by now. And something different comes up every time. And after reading it again, after finishing that book, I was slapping my forehead thinking, why didn't I write more about the scene where Peter Walsh is in the hotel thinking about the letter he's got from Virginia this morning? Because it was so obviously, at this point, the center of the book, as it had never been on the other 39 readings.
It's, Mrs. Dalloway is this deceptively small, hyper-local, but very vast story. And you've said it has the world-defining ambition and scope of every great epic, from Homer's Odyssey and Virgil's Aeneid to Dante's Commedia and Goethe's Faust. Can you elaborate on that? What are the quests and what do you think the quests are?
There are really a complicated answer here. There are two quests. One is that Virginia Woolf is playing with the Odyssean, the quest in the Odyssey that Joyce was also playing with in Ulysses, in which Peter Walsh is the Odysseus figure coming back, and Clarissa Dalloway is the Penelope figure, and Elizabeth, their daughter, is Telemachus, Odysseus' son, wandering around. But there's also this quest that Clarissa makes to the inside of her life. In all the heroic quests, there's always a descent into the world of death, a descent into the underworld, a descent into something like psychological death, which the hero must go through in order to reemerge in life. And this is what happens when Clarissa goes into the little room and experiences the death of Septimus Warren Smith in her own imagination. What Virginia Woolf was doing was, it seems to me, not claiming great merit. I make the point in the book that Joyce is writing a quest, but he calls his book Ulysses. He doesn't call it Mr. Bloom, whereas Virginia Woolf calls her book Mrs. Dalloway, and lets you discover all the depths within it.
That's interesting. I thought that Clarissa was Odysseus.
I think both are true.
Yeah, okay.
Both are true.
Because she is journeying.
That's right.
And also going into the underworld.
Yes.
And coming out with a revelation.
Yeah.
And it seemed to me, but Richard feels like a Penelope figure. And Peter seems like a really activated suitor.
No, I did not think of the third one, but you were of course right. And there are ways of reading Peter Walsh as if there's something nasty about him. I read someone saying you treat Peter Walsh very well. I think
But I love Peter. Yeah, but still, go on.
Great figure. I'm simply going to riff on what you said. It seems to me it's revelatory. Yes, her descent voyage into the little room in which she experiences what Septimus Warren Smith feels is what Odysseus experiences when he goes to the realm of the dead and is told his future and is told who he is by Tiresias. And Clarissa's wandering into Bond Street at the beginning is again that voyage.
We talked about the old woman that she sees from that side, the little room. And you just mentioned Tiresias. And it just occurred to me that in the book, Mrs. Dalloway is pretty sure that although the woman seems to be looking straight at her, she doesn't see her.
That's right, and we don't know this. I wish we had had this conversation before I wrote this book.
So a little bit of Tiresian encounter.
That's very much so. I mean, again, what I think we're demonstrating here is there is so much going on in this book that you shift the angle slightly and come at it from a personal perspective. You see a whole story which was invisible before.
Yeah. Also, I feel like you're obviously a great teacher, but I'm experiencing the greatness of your teaching because you're making me feel really smart.
Maybe that's true. The fact that you feel that way. There's a wonderful moment in Tess of the D'Urbervilles, which I've just been teaching, where Alec, the awful villain, says to Tess, "That's what every woman says," and she says, Yes, that's what every woman says, but did it never occur to you that might be what some women feel, so,
Beautiful.
So, shall I go on? I'm just continuing to riff on this idea. Clarissa going upstairs into the tower has this sense of living every day in great danger, how terrifying it was, and how she must withdraw into her own privacy. And there are, of course, the battles of the sexes between Clarissa and Peter have a lot to do with, as you say, the suitor in action. Peter's always flicking his knife, and Clarissa is brandishing her scissors, and you can see that Virginia Woolf is having a very good time with writing this scene.
Yeah.
So,
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
Can we talk about James Joyce's Ulysses a little bit in relation to the fact that this is what we have to
We love
with
to,
this,
yeah.
because it's a book that Woolf both admired and resisted, and of course was later denounced as having plagiarized or copied. It sort of looms large even 100 years later, and yet it is not the main it is not the main literary influence here.
No,
as I
I think
understand.
the Odyssey and a million other books and Shakespeare. Is this a thought you have some thoughts on before I launch
I
into?
will, full disclosure, I never made it through Ulysses.
Okay.
But yay! What strikes me is that Virginia Woolf almost invites dismissal. And that I
Yes.
consider that to be the comedic stance. Because if you're a comedian, and I don't mean necessarily stand up, although that's of course part of it, but if you have the point of view of comedy, which is very inclusive, and will never lead with, oh, I'm so deep, I'm so smart, right? It's ultimately redemptive and inclusive, and it invites dismissal. And if you're a woman, you really invite dismissal. So if you're inviting dismissal and you're a woman, basically Mrs. Dalloway,
Yes, that's right.
right? So it's stealth, but it's so incredibly powerful. I find it radical and courageous and really exciting. It's like, yeah, dismiss me. Yeah. I'm a rich lady buying flowers. Don't give a shit about me.
Ulysses.
But we follow her, right? She's heroic.
And Ulysses, which I taught a course once. It was a joint course taught by about 10 or 15 people, and we all taught the same syllabus. And we started reading Homer, and then Virgil, and then Dante, and then Cervantes, and then Goethe's Faust, and then Ulysses. And every year as I taught this, I would read Homer, and I'd learn more about Homer and the world, and I'd learn more about Virgil and the world. And you can see where this is going. Every time I read Ulysses, I learned more about Ulysses. I never learned more about the world in the way I learn more about the world every time I read Mrs. Dalloway. Ulysses is a book that seems to me far less deep than Mrs. Dalloway, because it never confronts our own moral crises inside. The central figure, Leopold Bloom, is morally perfect. He's ridiculous, but he's morally perfect. And he allows the reader to flatter oneself by thinking, yes, I make mistakes, I walk into the furniture, but I'm morally perfect. Whereas Clarissa Dalloway is not morally perfect, to put it mildly, and she comes to the great moral revelation of her connection with other human beings that no one comes to in Ulysses. A friend of mine was a teacher who used to shock his students by saying, Ulysses is the greatest superficial novel ever written. And I think there's something in that. It's got all this surface puzzle, but its vision of humanity is shallow and simplistic, and it's full of cleverness. And one thing that any book that people are proud to read is suspect, it seems to me, in this way. That, in other words, there's some motive that's gone wrong in why you would read it.
So no photos on Instagram of reading Ulysses.
That's right,
Okay.
yes, exactly. Yes, that's right.
Okay,
And here it is.
But one of the other reasons I wanted to bring that book up, though, is that there are, I was sort of intrigued at the idea that Austen and Eliot and Bronte are some of the infuse this book so much. I was surprised because I'm not someone who is a scholar, so hearing that that she's written essays at the same time about those writers, but it also made me think of Anne-Marie of Fane, because of course that's I guess you would say neo-Gothic Victorian novel. The Brontes' work is also sort of a guiding star in that way. Do you see
Have
that
anything in
did you
common
see
with
that in the
Virginia
novel?
Woolf? I hope so. Do I have anything in
Yes.
common with Virginia Woolf? Well, Fane is certainly a Victorian novel, right? And it avails itself of all the tropes and the delights and the devices and the structure. And of course, that's a container for something that is very, very now. It's interesting because it's very easy to look at Virginia Woolf as being, oh, she's just the opposite of the Brontes and Jane Austen, et cetera, et cetera. But I remember when I started learning about what stream of consciousness meant, it was so confusing that I just sort of thought, oh, I'm just going to read the books, because I thought the books are so real. The concrete is alive, and we were talking about this earlier. The concrete is contiguous with consciousness, and to me, that's reality. So my book is very definitely in a kind of a Victorian tradition, and I think I try to invite the reader to experience it at that level and to enjoy it at that level. And if they want to be open to other things that are resonating and going on, that's there too. I usually try to provide something for everybody. Yeah, I try anyway.
But the other Orlando also infuses Fane, and so we can't
Well,
not talk
of
about.
course, Orlando. Right. Does Fane exist without Orlando? No.
Does Orlando exist without its sort of faint imprints in Mrs. Dalloway in its explorations of gender and.
Right, and then when you also look at the kind of doubling, well, there's the Jane Eyre and Bertha, of course, but Mr. Rochester and Jane are also each other, right? That's anyway. Speaking of Orlando, but yeah, I think I don't think that anything I've written is possible without all the things that I've read. Not and in particular. Certain authors have been transformative and formative for me. Virginia Woolf, the Brontes are absolutely formative. I would say those are really the pillars.
Just on that theme, the Virginia Woolf would complain about Charlotte Bronte in her essays, saying her genius is incomplete and so forth, but she's clearly engaged with her. And it seems to me that in Mrs. Dalloway, the relation between Clarissa and Septimus Warren Smith is another doubling of the kind that Jane Eyre and Bertha Mason are in Jane Eyre. In Bertha Mason dies effectively so that Jane Eyre can marry Mr. Rochester, who is now a widower and is free to marry, and so. The way in which Septimus Warren Smith dies and Clarissa takes that as a means of finding new life is one of these doubling effects. I think the double is basically a 19th century invention as a way of talking about the unconscious mind, of talking about the dark impulses that people had no way of talking about. And my guess is that it tends to drop out of literature after psychoanalysis becomes part of common culture, because we've got a language for talking about Mr. Hyde rather than
Yes, the shadow or
that's
something
right,
that's
yes,
suppressed.
Right, yes, that's right, the Dostoevskian double.
In your book, The Inner Life of Mrs. Dalloway, it brought me to tears how you speak about the communication between Septimus Warren Smith via his death to Mrs. Dalloway in that room. And that resonates with one of the very powerful aspects of Jane Eyre, and it goes back to Fane, and I was very conscious of doing this with Fane, which is honoring the communication of shared consciousness. You know, when she's out on the moors and she hears the voice and it guides her, right? This idea that we are connected. And Mrs. Dalloway, for all the temperature change from the hot terrain of the Brontes, it's about the link of whether you call it spirit or consciousness or psyche, and that connection. So you've got the coolness of that London June day, but it's that same thing, and the way you wrote about that was something that I experienced as a revelation.
I think they were the same tears that I feel whenever I read that passage. I'm not joking. I think it always has that effect. The book is filled with these unspoken connections because Virginia Woolf is in part a realist, but everyone in the book has this sense of communicating without words, which happens in all of her novels, by the way. You know, people communicate without words. They have dialogues without actually speaking something. And something very uncanny goes on in which Clarissa experiences what has happened in someone she never met, someone she doesn't know. And it's something like the way Virginia Woolf talks about the relation of writer and reader in Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Brown, where she says the writer must talk about the weather to relax the reader so that he may be willing to enter into the more difficult business of intimacy. She thinks of the relation between the writer and the reader as an intimate relation. And something like that is also going on in this book. And I think the very last scene where Peter Walsh experiences this wonder and this terror, it certainly invites, sorry, I'll get this sentence out in some sense. It invites being read not simply as he sees Clarissa in the room, but in some way she has entered his consciousness, filling him with wonder and terror and extraordinary excitement, for it was Clarissa.
I mean, I'm thinking that you wrote, maybe not here, but you've adapted from one of your previous essays. You talk about Mary Shelley's Frankenstein and that imaginative flight that she has, because we as the reader know Septimus more than she does. We know more about him.
By far.
And that sort of Frankenstein moment that I can't remember. It's like the falling through the snow in the window or something.
Well, I'm not being difficult. I haven't read the book recently, you know. But certainly, Victor Frankenstein has a mysterious connection with the creature. He knows what's going on inside the creature's head. And the creature knows what's going on inside Victor Frankenstein's head. And they are so inseparable as doubles. And Victor Frankenstein refers to the creature as his vampire rising up to kill all those I was in love with. But when Victor hears that someone has been killed, he knows instantly that the creature has done it. And again, this is an uncanny connection between two consciousnesses. It's all over 19th century novels, it seems to me.
And that's interesting because Virginia Woolf is, I was always taught that, she is the vanguard. She starts something new that just shatters everything that came before. And
It's not true.
And now it's not true at all because she's all about those connections, and that was the great achievement in the 19th century, was showing those connections, and that's being borne out by more contemporary science too. So she's flying in the face of what's being discovered in her time, which is, oh no, it's all very cut and dried. We don't anthropomorphize animals. They have no feelings. We divide our sciences into, we're just going to chop everything up. Everything's going to be reductionist. We're going to noun everything. We're going to pin it. And that's all it is. And now are you dead? Good, I can find out who you are. So, and we can learn a lot from that, but it's very, very limited. And it seems to me that she might be doing something new and contemporary and modern feeling without the long sentences and the interiority, and you always feel like there's a camera sweeping around. So all of that is exciting and fresh, but it's all about making all of those connections. And in that way, it is not about what happens later with literature in modern literature, so-called, in the 20th century, which is about the kind of disintegrating connection.
When I teach a course in modern literature, I draw a diagram on the board talking about the modernist novel in which the narrator knows everything, all from the beginning, and the characters never learn everything that the narrator knows, in, say, in Joseph Conrad and The Secret Agent or in Ulysses. Whereas in the traditional novel, the narrator knows everything, and the novel comes to an end when the characters know what the narrator knows, which is Jane Eyre, for example. She knows everything. That's what happens in Virginia Woolf. She is the greatest traditional novelist in this way. She's the greatest novelist of happy endings. All of her novels after the second end with moments of triumph, with connection, with something like an emotional marriage at the end. And this is the traditional novel. She's not going out thinking, I have to tear something down. And she says in the introduction to Mrs. Dalloway that the book was accused of having a method. She said, no, it simply grew the way the snail grows its shell and so forth. She said there was there was a problem which I needed to solve, which is very different from saying, today I will be innovative, which is the way in which not actually to be innovative, but to solve a problem is to be innovative.
And we know all of this because reading Virginia Woolf's diaries in tandem with, the novel, or gives us a really fulsome picture of pretty much how she's metabolizing the culture around her and her creative life. We have a really, as an essayist, as an expert publisher by this point, how important are those everyday practices and our awareness of them in enjoying Mrs. Dalloway?
Phew.
This pattern of, I
Right.
mean the pattern of moving back and forth between fiction and nonfiction that she's doing all throughout her career.
It seems to me an essential principle that follows what she thinks is the book stands alone, but it never hurts to know something about it, if this makes sense. In other words, that what she made of reality seems to me to be the important thing. I tried to watch the film version of Mrs. Dalloway from 1997, which I'm told.
The Hours.
Was it
Not
the
by
Marlene
Cunningham.
Chorus?
There's a movie called The Hours based on Michael Cunningham, but
Yeah.
there's actually a film of Mrs. Dalloway with
It's available on Hoopla through the library
right.
if you want to watch
And-
it. With Vanessa Redgrave.
With Vanessa Redgrave, exactly. Anyway, I couldn't bear it because, for one thing, I know what the characters look like. I know exactly what the characters look like. And they don't look at all like the characters in the film. And part of the experience of reading the book is inventing this part of what's happening. And to say that this character is based on somebody, I think what becomes this becomes interesting, not in the sense that you now find the source, but what has Virginia Woolf done with the reality she deals with? So reading the diaries, for example, which I read all the way through in the past year, and it's an astonishing experience to see the variations in mood and the complexity of her thinking. She talks about the figure who was in many ways the source of Clarissa Dalloway, Kitty Maxey. And she doesn't quite care for Kitty Maxey. And she said at one point, I almost abandoned Mrs. Dalloway because Clarissa was too tinselly for me. But then I went into her inner life. And what's striking is, if you see a photograph of Kitty Maxey, who's a grande dame of the 1920s, what you see is some external figure. What you read in Virginia Woolf is this imaginative construction of this moral and emotional triumph inside Clarissa's head, which we have no reason to believe Kitty Maxey ever felt herself. I'm answering this in the roundabout way, that the point is not to go out and say, oh, well, this is really about so-and-so, but to look at it and say, see what a genius did with the raw material that she had to work with. And also, incidentally, to see her trying to decide what to do about the novel and worrying about it. Before you go on, one of the most wonderful moments in the diary is in which Virginia Woolf says, and anybody who's published a book will know this experience, that she says, when a new review comes in of my book, I write it in my head before I sit down and read it, and it's always disappointing to read what's on there.
But one of the other things that we get from her diaries is her talking about or maybe it's correspondence, discovering this tunneling method.
Discovering the what?
The
Sorry?
tunneling of characters. And I think back to interviews that you did about Fane and this supreme visual image, working through, the sketch or the image that comes to you as almost a visitation. I'm wondering if that resonates for you, her idea of tunneling, because it's so vivid.
And I like that you use the word invitation, because that I think of that in terms of my relationship with the reader, is that this is an invitation. And if you're going to come somewhere, I need to treat you very well. There's a trust, right? I take that very, very seriously. In terms of tunneling, I relate to that when it comes to working on a book, because sometimes I feel like, I remember when I was writing Fall on Your Knees, there were a lot of mining metaphors in the process too, right? Very much the underworld. But it was like, okay, writing. Taking a spoon and just digging a tunnel from here to home, maybe. But there is always a going down and through. And I always go, well, I've accepted the invitation to interrogate this image and to go and pose the questions and follow follow those answers, because the answers are really more and more and more questions. So hopefully, if you start off in enough tunnels, they do start to meet up, right? And then you're in a chamber, and then maybe you see the light. And but tunneling, not so much, because when I think about tunneling, that's very, very much in the beginning, and that's a very, very scary thing. What you really want to do is get somewhere, and then come back up with the story, right? And hopefully, I'm not dragging the readers through the tunnels.
We're talking a bit we're alluding to a passage, I think, in Virginia Woolf's diaries, where she says, I realize my method is to dig tunnels behind my characters, and then the tunnels meet in the background.
Okay, yeah, that
and
makes sense.
That's very explicitly her metaphor. And as you were talking, it occurs to me one difference between tunneling and taking the train is you don't know you're going to find when you're tunneling. You only have a vague idea, but who knows what's going to open up when you dig into it.
And that's why there's so much courage and stamina necessary for any writing, because you don't know where it's going to go. I was surprised earlier when you mentioned, you referred to having started an essay and not knowing where it was going to lead. And I thought that was a perk of writing essays and of the academic life. It's like, I know what I'm trying to say, and here I go saying it. So that really surprised me.
I realize that I can't, if I try to figure out how I'm going to end an essay, I'll never begin it. You discover how you're going to end it in the middle of it. And I think this is one point about thinking about Virginia Woolf's revisions. I think every writer has this experience of finding out what you meant at the end of writing it. Virginia Woolf says this in her diary at some point. She says, as I was writing it, I discovered what I meant, some phrase like that. In other words, through the process of revision. It's not, Percy Bysshe Shelley has the image in the Defense of Poetry of the poet's mind is like a fading coal, that the initial vision is the fiery flame is there, and if we could only see the original conception, we would be so dazzled, and what we get is something weak. That's getting it exactly backwards. In other words, it's through the process of revision that you get to the depths of these things.
And that's faith. That's really, really adhering faithfully to what called you in the first place.
That's right.
And even when it gets shabby and boring and you're exhausted, etc., you go, no, I'm sticking with this.
You use the word calling, which means, of course, that you're talking about something that is a vocation. A vocation is something you are called to. It's not a job.
Actually,
yeah. It's the voice calling you to do this thing. And ich kann nicht anders, as Luther did not say. I can't do otherwise. But it's reputed to say when the calling comes. Yes, very much so.
That tunneling image is such a kind of vivid, almost envisioning sort of the characters as objects, like in space in her mind. And I think correct me if I'm wrong, but I think one of the things you restore here is the 12 sections that she deliberately, that she imagined that there were specific line and page breaks. So the 12 sections, the divisions, each appointing an hour chapter. It's almost like the scaffolding is a visual for her, in so much as she was a publisher and took great pains with the trim size of the book and the story as an object in addition to its form. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Very well. Virginia Woolf, first of all, I see occasionally reviews say, and so discovered that there were 12 sections of the book. Well, anybody who had the book before it got reprinted and one of the sections got lost in the reprint would just be able to sort of count 1, 2, 3, 4, 12. But the 12 sections did get lost when the book was reprinted because printers would ignore it or the break would come at the bottom of the page. She's clearly thinking in terms of a large structure, and then when she first wrote it, she titled it The Hours. And she clearly had a shape, but she does something very interesting with this. A lot of modernist literature thinks in terms of cycles, and of course the cycle of the hours and the cycle of the day is a cycle. But every time Big Ben strikes in Mrs. Dalloway, it's the hour, something irrevocable. She's talking about something that will not come back. In other words, the hour has come and will not return. So in some way she's dealing with the sense of a structure that contains things that change, things that alter, things that cannot go back on what they... Am I responding to what you're saying?
Yeah, no, because it seemed like she took great care in like the shape of it.
She was an expert printer. She set type by hand. She bound her own notebooks in colored paper. She and her husband took real care over the typeface of the book, the size of the book, the size of the margins, the cloth that we're going to have. And of course, her sister, Vanessa Bell, provided the dust jackets for all of the books. And strikingly, in some of the early books, there are no blurbs, there are no comments. It's just the drawing on the cover and the book.
The book. How beautiful.
Just this little book.
Yeah. When you were mentioning tunneling, and I think I finally understood what you were asking me. Were you talking about in Fane, she actually literally goes into the earth?
Well, that, but also just the image of the genesis of the story for you, like this idea of excavating the image that comes to you at the beginning of the idea, I guess.
Yeah. And times arrow, times cycle. Was that a Stephen Jay Gould book?
That's right.
Right?
Yes, I think so. Yeah.
And that you know, the cyclical, that's where the mythical lives, and then the arrow, that's the nitty-gritty of our daily lives. And having those do things in tension in this book, right?
This is, Auden, whom I write about also, distinguishes natural and historical time. And natural in time is the time of cycles, that you get hungry, for example, at a certain time of day. But the historical time is the one that you choose, which is unique. I can choose either to be virtuous and eat a kale salad, or to be sinful and eat a double cheeseburger with cheese, and I'm making a moral choice in some way. But the experience of hunger is cyclical. It's going to happen impersonally. I can't decide whether to be hungry or not. I can decide what to do about that experience of hunger.
We're on that wheel.
That's right. Yeah, but what we do on that wheel is our own choice, which is again I'm stealing this from Auden. Auden talks about one event provoking another rather than causing another, and I find that revelatory. And that's essentially what happens over and over again in Virginia Woolf. You can always choose how to respond to provocation, and Clarissa responds to provocation. She will talk about being made to do this and made to do that, but then she responds with her own choices.
I think I have one more thing, and then we have to wrap up. I want to ask you both, because Woolf wrote about the phenomenon that runs through all great works of art, and I think she was referencing Charlotte Bronte at the time, but she says at each fresh reading, one notices some change in them, as if the sap of life ran in their leaves, and with skies and plants, they had the power to alter their shape and color from season to season. She's talking about the shape-shifting nature of work, of reading or seeing works. So how, for each of you, have maybe the emotional revelations of the book changed and shape-shifted as you've read it over the years? And where is it now? Like, is there a different character who holds a fascination for you at the moment, or that resonates with you at the moment?
Oh, that's a really, really beautiful question. And, you know, I read this novel when I was 17 or 18. And I think I read it again somewhere in midlife. But now I'm reading it, and I am older than Mrs. Dalloway. A lot older. And I don't know, like in early 20th century years, am I the same age? Actually, no, I'm chronologically older. So for me, it's, there's something, and I have daughters who are the age that they were in the reminiscence portions of the book, that green world. And I find it so moving. I'm finding it a more emotional experience now than I did then. Then I was dazzled. It was like I was tasting, you know, okay, this is a really cheesy comparison, but you remember those old candies called Lick-O-Maid, or like Sweet Tarts, or like just like powdered sugar with maybe a fruity tang to it, all chemical. But I remember like it being 6 years old, tasting this for the first time and going, what? And that was kind of the Mrs. Dalloway experience, just like lights going off in my head and around my psyche, not really getting it, but really getting it and being there in the kind of the dazzle of it. And now I feel like I'm there in the true heart of it. And that's another thing, that's going back to what you're saying about the book is owed of regard and of respect, right? Because the book is alive. It's a living it's an organism. It's alive, and that's how you know when you come back to a book and you go, oh, this is speaking to me, and it means something different. It's like meeting a friend, right?
The experience is, again, like speaking to a person. Your mood is going to be different. I'm not sure that in reading the book, my own life experiences have a direct effect, but it's certainly my mood, my sense of either focusing on the politics or the medicine or the flowers or the travel or the quest themes. This is always going to vary one time or another, and I think it's Virginia Woolf talks about the equal, and I forget what her phrase is, relation that the writer and reader has, and she's talking about it as if it's a kind of erotic, a libidinous relation that is in some way fertile. And in some way, what she'll do is provoke in me some reaction that I didn't have before as I happen to read a page more closely than I'd read the last time. One thing that took me a long time to see was how funny Virginia Woolf is, by the way, that she's a great comic writer. And To the Lighthouse, I hope I'm not going over time, I'm just going to switch to The Lighthouse. I never got it into focus because it was treated as something really serious until maybe 3 or 4 readings when I realized this is an extremely funny book. That Lily Briscoe is there thinking about love and her love for Mrs. Ramsay, and she thinks maybe I should listen to the conversation because someone might be talking about this question of love. And then what she hears is Mr. Banks saying, English coffee is a terrible, whatever, drink, and that's the way people answer about love. It's the comedy of it is really quite striking, but she manages to keep it well concealed until you start listening to it. So.